Elaine Vaughan, born in 1873 in Herefordshire, the youngest of 4 children. The family were respectable members of the Vaughan dynasty, but were not at all wealthy. Elaine was named after the heroine of the Arthurian legend, Our Lady of Shalott. The name Elaine was popularised in Victorian society by the Pre-Raphaelites, Gabriele Rossetti and John William Waterhouse, with their paintings of Elaine, the Lady of Shalott, who was cursed to live in a towering mansion, unable to look directly out into the world. By the time Elaine built her own mansion in 1930's High Salvington, she was already a widow. She had married well, in 1896, to a London barrister, Richard Bramwell Davis, becoming Mrs. Elaine Bramwell Davis. In an interview written in the Worthing Herald, Elaine describes herself as a young woman.
I was presented on my first marriage at the court of Queen Victoria. I have been to court many times since then.
Elaine, on Richard's death, had inherited a large enough sum to build her own Blenheim, named after the former private residence in England. A site was chosen in Coke Street along the Arundel Road, high above the sea, where neighbouring Durrington was just a collection of nursery lands and a windmill. Elaine was an amateur artist, trained by the famous Cattermoles of Sussex, principally her neighbour and mentor Lance Cattermole. With his input she was able to build a glowing white mansion house in a modern 1930s style, but with her own arts and crafts-inspired interior. Having been born into a family of middle-class clergy, Elaine, living in Blenheim Court in New Year 1938, suddenly was on the verge of becoming one of the wealthiest women Britain had ever known. In January, news reached her that her favourite aunt, Lady Houston, had died from self-inflicted starvation. Lady Houston, Elaine's mother's sister, was a force of nature. The 9th child of 10 children, she reached notoriety as professional dancer, a chorus girl known as Poppy. By the end of her life she was an aviation pioneer, newspaper publisher, a suffragette, philanthropist and socialite rebel. Her funding of the seaplane paved the way for the Spitfire, but she went out of her way to annoy people. In 1932 she offered to give $200,000 to strengthen the British Armed Forces. When the Prime Minister refused the money, Houston hung a huge electric sign, "Down with MacDonald the traitor," in the rigging of her steamship and sailed round Great Britain with it. In the months before her death, Houston had fallen in love with Edward, the Prince of Wales, sending him a cheque for $40,000 on his birthday. However, she was so distraught by the abdication, which she believed was the result of sinister forces from Moscow, that she stopped eating and died of a heart attack on the 29th of December 1936, aged 79. Houston left no will, and as her only surviving blood relative in Britain, Elaine stood to inherit £7 million. The story took another twist in July 1937 when unexpectedly two separate claims to the estate were made from Australia. In the end, the colossal windfall went into the pocket of a Brisbane horse trainer, Spencer Radmal Vaughan, the son of Houston's older brother. The story of Elaine and her beloved mansion was far from over. In the following years, Elaine was to become a leading figure of the Sussex war effort, and owing to personal tragedy would suddenly find love again. When war was declared, Elaine wasted no time, and from her White House on the Hill masterminded fundraising ideas and gathered military supplies. As a vice president of the Red Cross, Blenheim Court was generously given over to the war effort, becoming the principal supply depot of the Red Cross. A huge air raid shelter, still partially visible in the 1990s, was dug beneath the house to safeguard these precious supplies. Despite opening her home to the world, Elaine was a solitary figure. Her husband had been gone for 20 years. When the war began, and unexpectedly their only surviving son, Richard, who had emigrated to Sweden, died of a sudden heart attack. Elaine faced the prospect of growing old in Worthing without any living family. It is against this backdrop of tragedy that Elaine's life unpredictably changed forever, for the better. The very public work she had taken to keep herself occupied brought her to her next great love, Mr. Frederick Sanderson, a Scottish-Canadian brought back to England by the outbreak of war. Within a year of their meeting, Sanderson was living in Blenheim Court, and the two were engaged to be married. A reporter visited Blenheim and toured the house with Elaine, who tells her story in her own words. She spoke first of Mr. Sanderson.
He is Scottish by birth, and an extremely clever electrical engineer, a specialist at his work, although he has not got all his buttons yet. He is very well read. He came over here, voluntarily, from Canada. We have known each other for more than a year. My son, as you know, died a few months ago, and I have been very lonely. Because of the death of my son, I wanted the wedding kept very quiet. I would have liked us to have walked over to the church and got married without anyone knowing anything about it. But the news seems to have leaked out.
A peep at the busy, white-clad hospital supply workers, and I was taken on a tour of this charming, simply planned house. Pictures everywhere, a modern portrait of my hostess in Red Cross uniform by Lance Catamole. A lovely girlhood pose caught by a woman artist, family portraits, landscapes, even a witty caricature or two. 5 decades later, when Blenheim was an empty shell, the absent gallery of pictures still lingered, their impressions imprinted on the walls, with the geometric marks left by sun damage, and nail scars deeply riven into the plaster. A room on the first floor was used by Elaine to create her own artworks, described by visiting reporter, Jolly Little Gnomes caper around a frieze, and on one wall Mrs. Bramwell Davis had started a brilliantly decorative circus scene. There were also numerous personal portraits created by Elaine.
I paint my friends and give them the pictures. I have only had a few lessons from Lance Catamole.
Even with the best of health and good intentions for a long marriage, when Elaine and Frederick married, Elaine was already in her 70s and her family was not blessed with the gift of longevity. Surprising then, that Elaine and Frederick were to live on together for the best part of 30 years. Elaine died at the age of 96 on the 10th of July 1969. Frederick survived his wife by 10 years. passing in the late 70s. So, what of the stories of unexpected deaths in Blenheim Court? What truth is there in stories of murder, arson and fatal accidents? Or ruined houses carry a forlorn air, and local superstitions and hearsay can work to create fantastical and largely imagined myths about them? Surely Blenheim Court, with its reputation as an artist's retreat and lovebird's nest for 30 years, is another victim of circumstance? It had the misfortune of becoming a ruin, and so became the perfect backdrop for intrigue and mystery. However, Blenheim Court did hold a surprising and forgotten secret hidden within its walls. A fatal accident had indeed befallen someone within Blenheim. Eerily on July the 10th, the very date that Elaine herself would pass, the inquest into the death of Mary Jane Levy took place. Elaine was called as only witness to the bizarre set of circumstances that occurred a month before. Elaine, rattling around in her brand new yet bare mansion, was at this time the exact mirror of her namesake, the Lady of Sherlock. She was yet to find love and become the local society lady of the war years. Eventually her loneliness obliged her to employ a local lady as her companion. Mary Jane at 62 was around Elaine's age, but of a lower social standing. It was not unusual for a lady of some means to employ a lady who could help provide the usual requirements in a servant with the added benefit of companionship. Elaine described the freak accident to the inquest, which happened at about tea time on the 20th of June 1936. Elaine heard a sudden cry coming from the foot of the main staircase in Blenheim's hallway. Rushing to her companion's side, Elaine found Mary Jane, apparently lifeless, laying face down in the hall. The nearest hospital at this time was Southlands Hospital in Shoreham, some miles away, and Mary Jane's condition deteriorated after an attempt to operate. The medical office reported that an X-ray had shown a fracture of Mary's right femur, broken in the fall. The attempt to operate had resulted in a pulmonary embolism which hastened her death. The coroner recorded a verdict of accidental death, in accordance with the medical evidence, but how Mary came to fall in the first place still remains a mystery. Whether this was from a sudden faint or the uneven stairs, we shall never know, as the death of Mary Jane Levy passed out of living memory. Although Elaine's story had a happy ending, the opposite can be said for her Blenheim. Its ideal positioning on the verge of the Downs was in the end its great downfall. For years another local socialite and celebrity, Nancy Price, who found fame as a star of the silver screen, campaigned from her Fimden home to resist development on the Downlands. During the years of Blenheim's success as a Red Cross depot, a German plane crashed in a field between Blenheim and her own cottage Arcane. Most of the crew were killed in the crash. One survivor, however, was discovered by Nancy, wandering dazed amongst the wreckage. Nancy promptly invited him to Arcane for a coffee and a sit-down before she telephoned the military. Nancy Price left her mark on the countryside above Worthing in a way that Blenheim sadly never could, leaving behind a stretch of unspoiled downlands called the Sanctuary, which she personally contributed to protect from development. Nancy left a legacy ensuring that future sites could be bought and safeguarded from the surge of cheap prefab housing. With the passing of the Sandersons, Blenheim Court over the coming decades was allowed to become a tumble-down wreck. The wilderness around it needed no encouragement to encroach. By the mid-1990s it was no longer weatherproof. The tiles had fallen and the rafters were exposed to the elements. When the adjoining land of Coat House was scheduled for redevelopment in 2004, the building was finally demolished, leaving behind little trace of its story. All land north of Arundel Road now forms part of the South Downs National Park. Today, the only physical remains of Blenheim Court are the drop curbs of the former driveway and Elaine's wrought iron gates, now permanently locked.